So in this video, we're going to talk about yarn weight. So how thick a thread of yarn is and why that's important. So as you start knitting, a lot of the patterns are going to call for a very specific gauge of your needle and a very specific weight of yarn. And that is the yarn or the type of yarn and the type of needle that a pattern is tested to ensure a specific fit. Especially, this is really critical for fitted garments, hats, socks, gloves, sweaters, things like that. And you definitely want to pay attention to it. And as much as it is to buy very fun yarns that may not be quite right for the pattern you're using, you definitely don't want to end up with a 10-foot wide shawl when you're done. I know from experience. Please listen to that. So I have a few examples of different weights here. The one here on the bottom is the smallest weight. This is lace weight. There is actually a smaller weight of yarn than this one. This is not the best example because it kind of puffs up a little bit. But this is a lace weight yarn. This is one of the finest yarns that you can buy. There is another size or two smaller than this one. And this one is just a really, really fine weight. This orange strand is a weight of sock yarn. Super fine yarn. This is also referred to as fingering weight yarn. Right here, this is a worsted weight. That one is a little bit heavier and typically is used, often you'll see sweaters or hats and mittens made out of worsted weight. It's a bit heavier or thicker yarn. It's also a little bit warmer. It creates a much thicker fabric. Then you have a super bulky. This one's very big and thick. You can kind of see just based on my hands how big that one is. That one's a very thick one. That one you would want to use for something like a blanket or an afghan. And then here I have a jumbo yarn that I happen to have. I just wanted to show an example of what the jumbo yarn is. And this particular strand of yarn is huge. I don't think most people are going to be using that as beginner knitters. So how do you tell what weight a yarn is when you buy it? So most websites are really good about indicating the yarn weight on the label. So this one is a Sun Valley Fibers. This is a lace weight. That's what this pink one is. So it does say lace weight yarn here. And you'll actually see that the lace weights will come in much larger skeins. So this one is an 800 yard. When it comes to fingering weight, you'll also see a little ball of yarn image and a number in it. And that indicates what the yarn weight is. And this is a standardized measurement, or fairly standardized measurement. And I'll put a link to my favorite chart in there. And that you can use to help gauge what weight your yarn is before you buy it. Again, most websites are really good about having their yarns searchable by weight. That is the easiest way to do it, but always take a look and see if you see, make sure that you're using the weight that you want. A harder method is that this is actually recommending, if you see it here, that 4-inch by 4-inch square is 28 to 30 stitches by 42 rows on a 3 millimeter or US 2 to 6 needle. Well, it's recommending a US 2 to 6 needle. This is a 3 millimeter, but that's the gauge, is a 28 to 30 stitch and 42 rows. This is a really difficult method, in my opinion, to understand what your weight is. So there's the chart that I'm linking also has a little hint to how to understand what this gauge is. So right now, I wouldn't worry too much about that. Our first few projects are going to be using a worsted weight yarn and a US 7 needle, and I'll make sure that we talk about exactly which yarn we want to buy for that one too. And I'll talk about that in this video. I also wanted to go through a couple of things to be aware of when you purchase yarn. The first thing is, if your yarn comes like this is called a hank. This yarn is not ready to knit. If we take this apart, you can see that it's just really have a long loop of yarn, and this will tangle in a minute if you don't wind this into a ball. So if you purchase one like this, make sure that you wind this into a ball before you start using it. Typically, you can ask for your local yarn store. If you've purchased it at the yarn store, not if you've purchased it at Michael's, if you've purchased it at the yarn store, they will have a yarn winding service. And they'll wind it into what's called a cake, which is what this is. That's a cake. That's a usable. This one is also comes in already balled. So this one is also ready to use. This one is nice because this one I can use as both a center pull, which means I can pull from inside, or I can use the yarn from the outside, which is really nice for socks because you can knit both inside. You can knit 2 socks at a time, one from each end of the ball of yarn. I also want to cover a few things of what not to buy on your first time you're knitting. And in fact, the first quite a few times that you're knitting, I just want to make sure that nobody gets too excited or overly excited about some of the fancier yarns. I did go to Michael's and I purchased a few there. I have a recommendation from Michael's for our first projects, but I wanted to go through some of these options that I found that I want you to stay away from. The first one is anything that looks like this. This is an incredibly fuzzy yarn. And this is very difficult to work with. It's very pretty, but it is really difficult to work with. I'll zoom out here so you can see it a little bit better. And this one is the Caron latte cakes. But you can see this is really fuzzy. This is going to get really confusing, especially if you're not comfortable with knit and purl stitches yet. So the next up is yarn that looks like this, and it might be hard to see, but this one is a single ply of yarn, and it's very smooth and really soft, which is what makes it appealing. I'm not sure how well this is coming off on video, but this is a single ply of yarn. This yarn will split when you're knitting. So I guarantee that this is gonna be very difficult to work with as you're knitting with it as a beginner. You wanna look for something that is more tightly plied, like this one. You can see that this one has nice plies in it. I don't know if you can see the twist in that. And it's tightly twisted and it's not coming apart. This one would be a really nice one to knit with when we get started. But I have a yarn recommendation for our first projects, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this video. The next one is yarn that looks like this. This one has a nice twist to it, but the problem with this one is because it has contrasting colors of white and dark gray, this makes it really difficult to see your stitches and really understand what's going on with your stitches. When you first start knitting, it's really important that you can see your stitches and learn your pattern of your stitches so that as you're knitting, you can understand the mistakes that you're making and spot them easily. So it's really important to kind of stay away from this style of yarn as well. So the next one, so this one looks like it would be a great option. It looks like it's tightly spun. It looks like it's got everything. It's got the same properties of the other one that I showed you. You can see that it's got layers. You can see that it's kind of splitting, that it's not staying together particularly well when I push it together. So the reason though that I picked this one is it's very soft and it's really slippery. So this yarn is going to slide off of your needles and be very difficult to work with. I want you to have success in your first projects, and this is not the best one. This one is the soft and shiny. This one's from Michael's. So beware of anything that's too shiny or too slippery. That one is going to be problematic as you learn how to knit. And the last one is the one, and I say this out of pure experience, not to buy this one when you're first getting started knitting. And this is really an infamous one. This is the Lion brand yarn homespun. It's soft, it's pretty, it looks fuzzy. This is an absolute nightmare to work with. You can even tell that the ball has already started coming apart on this, and it's really this splits like crazy when you're knitting it, and it's really confusing when you're first learning how to knit where your stitches are when you use this one. So as much as we all have started on homespun, please learn my lesson and don't buy this one. Save this one for when you're more experienced with knitting. So the one I do recommend from Michaels, I do actually recommend for our first projects, is actually the Caron Cotton Cakes. So our first project is going to be washcloths. We want those to be in cotton. Those are easily machine washable. And we want to use a worsted weight yarn. So we can see here that this is a medium, number 4, which is what we want. And this is 60% cotton and some acrylic. So this one's going to be really good for making washcloths. So this is my cheap option. This one was about $14 for this giant cake of yarn. This cake will probably make somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 washcloths. It's going to make a million washcloths. So this one is a really good one for that first series of projects and for learning to knit on it. It's also a really nice tightly wound. You can see that it's not going to come apart and it's not going to split. And I apologize if you hear crinkling in the background. That's Lucy. She's eating the plastic bag, but she's not actually eating it. She's just fake eating it, but she likes the sound of the crinkling bag. So again, this one is Caron Cakes, Cotton Cakes. So I'll put a link to that in this video, and for the video for the getting started on the projects. So the last one is Dishy. This is the other one that I recommend. This one is also a worsted weight. So it says it right there on the label, worsted weight. And this is 100% cotton yarn. This one I get from a website called Knit Picks. This is my recommendation for kind of lower middle range yarn. So this one was probably $6. It's a considerably smaller. And it is not going to knit quite as many washcloths, but I do like this company a lot for their yarns. This has a lot of pretty good yarn for getting started if you don't want to dive into the more expensive yarns. So again, this one's kind of my Knit Picks is generally like a lower to middle range of yarns. And they also have a lot of tools available. So I'll put a link to their website and a couple of the tools that I also recommend for this. So our first project, I'm going to be using Dishy. I'm also going to be using our Clover US 7, I believe. Let me double check that. Yeah. So our Clover US 7 wood needles. So I'm going to be using those for both I'm going to do a video on the knit stitch and a video on the purl stitch, and then we're going to get into our project videos. So this is the one I'm going to use. These needles and this Dishy are what I'm going to use for those projects.